The winter of 1899 descended upon Oak Haven, Montana, with a cruelty that settled deep into the bones of the logging community. The air was a razor, and the tall, unforgiving pines of the Kootenai National Forest pressed in on the town like silent, judging sentinels. Here, where the roar of the sawmills was the heartbeat, lived Elias Thorne, a quiet, intense boy of 16, whose usual task was to haul logs with his father, Jed. The change in Elias began subtly, a slight tremor in his hands, a sudden, inexplicable aversion to the darkening windows of their cabin. He'd always been stoic, a necessity in their harsh life, but now a profound unease clung to him like the damp forest air. It culminated one bitter November evening. Elias burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut with a violence that made the kerosene lamp shudder. He was soaked in icy mud, his eyes wide and unfocused, fixed on something unseen behind him. "They were there, Pa," he gasped, fighting for breath. "They followed me from the clearing." Jed Thorne, a man whose patience was as worn as his work gloves, set down his supper knife. "What in God's name are you talking about, Elias? You're soaked." "Not bears, Pa, not wolves," Elias insisted, backing against the hearth. His voice was a raw, desperate whisper. "They move. Wrong. Low to the ground. Fast. And the sound. A dry, clicking sound, like stones grinding. They watch, Pa. They just watch." Jed followed him out onto the porch, lantern held high. The woods were a wall of impenetrable black. The only sounds were the wind sighing through the pines and the rhythmic thump-thump of his own heart. "There's nothing, son. You've been working too hard. The forest plays tricks on the mind when it's cold." But Elias couldn't be calmed. Over the next few days, the sightings became more frequent, more insistent. He described seeing low, vaguely canine shapes, too sleek, too quiet for local wildlife, darting between the shadows near the mill. He found scratches on the outer edge of their property, not deep claw marks, but long, thin, parallel abrasions on the wood, as if made by hard, chitinous nails. The townspeople, hardy and practical, quickly dismissed Elias's claims. They spoke of cabin fever, the psychological strain of the isolated wilderness. Dr. Hemlock, the town's elderly physician, suggested extreme anxiety bordering on delusion, likely brought on by the grueling work and the isolation. Elias's descent into fear created a rift with his father. Jed, fearing for his son's sanity and reputation, tried to enforce a normalcy that no longer existed for Elias. "You keep talking like this, Elias, and folks will think you've cracked. We don't need that. We're loggers, not poets seeing monsters." The true turning point arrived with the disappearance of Barnaby, the Thorne family's aging but reliable sheepdog. Barnaby vanished one evening, leaving behind no blood, no struggle, only a deep, unnatural silence. Elias found something that morning that chilled him far more than any blood trail. A small, hard, dark pellet lodged in the frost near the shed. A perfectly compacted fecal sample, utterly unlike anything from a known local predator. It was too uniform, too smooth. He wrapped it in an oilcloth, a desperate piece of evidence. Later that day, Elias was splitting wood when the sound returned. The dry, rapid clacking. He looked up, and for the first time saw one clearly, not a shadow but a shape. It was no taller than a large dog, covered in coarse, oily black fur, but its head was wrong. Flatter, with a long, almost insect-like snout, and eyes that were reflective, but too wide apart, suggesting a predatory field of vision. It was gone in a flicker, moving with a crawling, disjointed gait that defied the musculature of a typical mammal. Elias didn't scream. He didn't run. He just stood there, the axe heavy in his hands, the terrifying certainty settling over him. They were real, and they were hunting him. The fear was no longer paralyzing. It was crystallizing into a desperate need to understand and survive. He knew he couldn't rely on his father or the town. His story was too outlandish. He had to prove it. He had to find someone who would believe in something they couldn't see, smell, or categorize. He remembered the talk around the mill about the arrival of a Pinkerton detective, Alistair Reed, in the next county over, investigating a minor railroad fraud case. A professional observer, trained to see past the obvious. Elias knew it was a long shot, but he wrapped the pellet and a rough, feverish sketch of the creature in his journal. It was his only hope. He just had to survive the next night to deliver it. The clicking was closer now. The story of Elias is just beginning. Reality is crumbling, and the mystery deepens. To not miss what happens to him, and whether Detective Reed will believe his account, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Leave a like if the mystery of Oakhaven is giving you the shivers. The journey to the next county, a brutal 17-mile trek through snow-dusted forest, took Elias a grueling day and a half. He reached the small, grimy railroad office where Alistair Reed, a man whose sharp eyes contradicted his weary, dust-covered trench coat, was concluding his mundane investigation. Reed was a man of facts, of ledgers and verifiable truths. He had little patience for the hysteria of isolated frontier towns. Elias, exhausted and smelling of pine and frantic fear, burst into the temporary office. "Detective Reed, I need your help. I'm being hunted." Reed, mid-signature, paused. He assessed the boy. Too intense, too desperate, yet clearly not a vagrant. "Slow down, son. Take a breath. Hunted by whom?" "Not whom, what?" Elias whispered, placing his crude parcel on the desk. He unwrapped the oilcloth, revealing the sketch, a frantic depiction of the low-slung, insect-snouted animal and the hard, dark, fecal pellet. Reed picked up the pellet first, turning it over with the tip of his pen. It was dense, uniform, and unnaturally smooth. He was instantly intrigued, though skeptical of the source. "What is this? The droppings of a peculiar badger?" "It's from the creatures that took my dog, sir. They've been circling my cabin. They make a clicking sound. They're not from around here." Elias's voice was strained, the effort of maintaining coherence almost painful. He recounted the scratches, the unsettling stillness after Barnaby disappeared, and the fleeting, terrifying visual confirmation. Reed listened with the practiced detachment of a professional trained to filter madness from truth. The drawing was too detailed, too consistent for a spontaneous hallucination. The boy was genuinely terrified. But creatures that science couldn't explain in 1899 Montana? Impossible. "Elias," Reed said, leaning forward, his voice a measured low tone. "I appreciate your concern. You've clearly been through an ordeal. But I deal in facts. Everything you've described, the shapes, the sounds, could be explained by mountain lions, coyotes, or even a sustained psychological delusion brought on by isolation and stress. I'm a detective, not a man who chases myths." "But the pellets, sir! The way they move! It's wrong! It's biological, but it's wrong!" Elias slammed his fist softly on the desk, a gesture of pure frustration. Reed picked up the pellet again. "This, I admit, is peculiar. It's too uniform for any common carnivore, and too dense for a herbivore. I can send it to a lab in Helena, but that will take weeks." Elias realized he was losing him. He needed to anchor Reed in his world. "Come back with me, just for one night. My father thinks I'm sick, but he doesn't hear the clicking when he sleeps. You're a detective. See the lack of tracks, the way they move, the silence of them. Then decide." Alistair Reed, despite his skepticism, saw an opportunity. The railroad fraud was concluded. He was due back in the city, but the sheer conviction of the boy, coupled with the genuinely anomalous nature of the pellet, tapped into his investigative curiosity. He wasn't looking for monsters, he was looking for the source of the boy's fear. Was it a hidden predator, an elaborate prank by rivals, or simply the collapse of a young mind? "Fine," Reed conceded, pulling a small, nickel-plated revolver from his coat. I'll ride back with you. I will observe. But I want to make one thing perfectly clear. I am not hunting your monsters. I am investigating the events surrounding a psychological disturbance. They set off immediately, Reed riding his sturdy horse, Elias walking alongside, maintaining a frantic pace. The detective observed Elias keenly during the journey. The boy was constantly scanning the woods, reacting to shadows and the snap of dry branches that Reed dismissed as normal forest noises. As they approached Oakhaven, the snow began to fall, soft and thick, promising to obliterate any hope of finding fresh, meaningful tracks. Reed felt a twinge of frustration. If there was an explanation, the snow would bury it. They reached the Thorne cabin just after dusk. Jed Thorne was suspicious and cold toward the detective, viewing him as an outsider validating his son's madness. He's not a criminal detective, he's just tired. I'm just here to observe, Mr. Thorne. I assure you, Reed replied smoothly. That night, Reed and Elias sat vigil in the dark, silent living room. Reed held the shotgun Jed reluctantly provided. Elias held only a heavy piece of firewood. The only light was the dying embers in the hearth. Reed was beginning to feel foolish, his skepticism hardening into certainty that he was wasting his time. The only creature he expected to see was a squirrel. Then, just after midnight, in the profound silence of the fresh snowfall, Reed heard it. It was faint, barely audible over the rush of his own blood, but undeniably present. A rapid, dry, crut sound, like 1,000 tiny shards of slate being rapidly scraped together, coming from the edge of the woods, just beyond the perimeter of the cabin's small clearing. It was mechanical, biological, and utterly alien to the natural chorus of the Montana night. Elias's eyes, wide and terrified in the dark, locked on Reed's face. The boy's trembling was now audible. Reed's detached professional interest vanished, replaced by a cold, immediate fear. He raised the shotgun, its metallic weight comforting and utterly insufficient. The clicking stopped. A heartbeat of silence, then a quick, soft scritch sound just outside the back window, followed by the faint, distinctive odor of old oil and wet earth. Reed felt the hairs stand up on his neck. This was not a mountain lion. This was something else. Something he was wholly unprepared for. Alistair Reed woke before dawn, the shotgun still clutched in his hands. The air was frigid, the cabin thick with an oppressive silence. Elias was already awake, perched by the window, his gaze fixed on the yard. The clicking sound from the previous night had been brief, but its effect on Reed was profound, shattering his rational framework. He hadn't seen anything, but he had heard something that defied his extensive experience with wildlife and criminal activity. "Did you hear it move away?" Reed asked, his voice low. "It went silent," Elias whispered. "That's what they do. They go silent and then they're gone. Or they come back faster." Jed Thorne was up, stirring the stove. He looked from his son to the detective, a look of profound resignation and worry clouding his face. "Did your fancy education tell you what's wrong with the boy, detective?" "I heard a sound last night, Mr. Thorne," Reed admitted, his tone grave. "It was unusual. I'd like to look outside." The snowfall had stopped an hour or two before dawn, leaving a perfect, unblemished blanket of white across the clearing. Reed stepped out cautiously, scanning the woods. The air was still and clear. He circled the cabin, Elias trailing behind him. Near the back window, where the scritch sound had occurred, Reed stopped. The snow was untouched, save for a few loose flakes that had settled from the roof. "Nothing," Jed grunted from the porch, a bitter triumph in his voice. "No tracks. No evidence. Just the boy's overactive imagination." "Wait," Reed said, ignoring Jed. He knelt, examining the snow beneath the porch overhang, a spot shielded from the heaviest flakes. There, barely indenting the surface, were tracks. They were not paw prints. They were 3 long, thin, parallel impressions, like a bird's track, but heavier, wider, and without any recognizable heel or toe pad. They moved in an unsettling, staggered line, as if the creature wasn't walking or running, but scuttling. "Those are them," Elias breathed, pointing to the spot where the scuttling prints abruptly ended at the edge of the deeper snow. "They don't leave tracks in the deep stuff. They're too light, or they move too fast to sink in." Reed pulled a small notebook and pencil from his coat, sketching the tracks meticulously. The geometry was all wrong. These weren't the tracks of a known predator. "They end here, Elias. Where do they go?" Elias pointed towards a dense thicket, a confusing mass of fallen logs and low-hanging branches about 50 yards from the cabin. "They weave through the low cover. They don't like open ground. That's why they stick to the edge of the clearing. They use the underbrush." Reed realized the difficulty of the situation. He had circumstantial evidence, a strange pellet, an anomalous sound, and now bizarre, non-specific tracks. Nothing that would convince the outside world, but enough to fully engage his analytical mind. This was a mystery, a biological puzzle, and possibly a serious threat to the community, not just Elias's sanity. "I need to get a proper sample of the track before the sun melts it," Reed stated, already thinking of plaster casting. He was a detective, not a field biologist, but the principle was the same. Secure the evidence. He and Elias spent the next hour examining the property perimeter. They found more of the thin, parallel scratches on the lower planks of the woodshed, deeper this time, consistent with the description of the animal having chitinous nails. They also found something far more disturbing. A small patch of dense, dried blood on a splintered log near the woodpile, far too dark to be fresh, yet too plentiful to be from a mere scratch. "Barnaby," Elias choked out, his eyes filling with unshed tears. "They didn't just chase him off, they got him here." The blood confirmed the predation, but still offered no clear identification of the predator. Reed gathered a small sample of the dried blood using a clean piece of linen, meticulously cataloging the location. "We need a better vantage point, Elias," Reed decided, "and we need to know what they are eating besides your dog. If they are multiplying, this logging camp is in danger. Their diet is the key to understanding their habitat and nature." They climbed to the roof of the small tool shed, giving them a wider view of the forest boundary. The tension was palpable. Reed's skepticism had been replaced by a focused, urgent concentration. He wasn't looking at a psychological break anymore. He was looking at an unclassified biological threat, a terrifying proposition for a frontier town in 1899. "We need to find their path, their den," Reed said, adjusting the rifle. "They move silently, but they leave evidence. We just have to know how to read it. Tell me everything you remember about their movement, Elias. Every detail." Elias, for the first time in days, felt a genuine flicker of hope, not because the fear was gone, but because he was finally believed. He began describing their low, rapid, almost fluid scuttling, how they seemed to prioritize shadow and low cover, and the way the reflected light in their eyes seemed to be horizontal, not circular, like a fish or a reptile. The hunt was on, but the hunted was now leading the investigation. The morning after finding the tracks intensified the situation. Jed Thorne, seeing the determination in the detective's eyes, finally began to waver in his conviction that his son was mad. Fear, raw, biological fear, began to infect the practical logger. He agreed to let Reed and Elias use the shed as an observation post, providing them with his best hunting rifle and a few tins of preserved food. Reed and Elias spent the better part of the day constructing a makeshift blind within the shed, covering the small window with sacking, leaving only narrow slits for observation. Reed explained the necessity of a scientific approach. "We can't rely on panic, Elias. We need data. When do they hunt? How many? What is their pattern of movement?" The day passed in agonizing silence. The snow continued to fall lightly, refreshing the camouflage of the woods. The constant vigil was mentally draining. Elias, however, was fueled by a mixture of terror and validation. He spotted the slightest shift in the shadows, the smallest rustle of dry leaves caught in the breeze, meticulously logging it in Reed's notebook. As dusk deepened into the crushing blackness of the Montana winter night, the temperature dropped precipitously. They huddled in the shed, their breath clouding the air. The only light was a small shielded lantern, casting their faces in an anxious, flickering glow. "They'll be out soon," Elias murmured, his face pressed against a sighting slit. "They always start when the cold really settles in. They're more confident under a deep, still darkness." Alistair Reed, despite his logical training, felt a profound tension gripping his chest. He checked the rifle's action, the snick of the mechanism deafening in the silence. He was a detective. His weapon of choice was interrogation, not a high-powered hunting rifle. At precisely 8:47 p.m., according to Reed's pocket watch, the clicking began again. This time it was closer, more rapid, and there was an unsettling syncopation to the sound, suggesting multiple creatures moving in coordination. Kurt, 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 Kurt. Elias pointed a shaking finger through the slit. There, near the big spruce. Reed sighted the rifle. He could make out a shifting shadow, too low, too fast for a deer, too silent for a wolf. He raised the hammer. He needed a clear shot, an undeniable piece of evidence, a body. The creature didn't move as expected. Instead of circling, it darted straight at a large stack of chopped firewood Jed had left near the shed. It was a terrifyingly efficient low-to-the-ground rush. It reached the pile, and instead of tearing into the wood, it began to dig furiously at the base. "They're not after the wood," Elias exclaimed. "They're after what's under it. Maybe something is nesting there." Before Reed could get a bead on the creature, the entire perimeter exploded in activity. 3 more clicking sounds erupted from different directions, one near the outhouse, one near the well, and one behind the cabin. They weren't hunting. They were isolating their target, creating a distraction. Suddenly, the large creature digging at the woodpile stopped. It raised its flat, dark head, and its reflective eyes locked onto the small, dark aperture of the shed window. It had smelled or heard them. The air was ripped by a sound far worse than the clicking. A low, dry, rasping hiss, like air escaping a punctured lung. The creature launched itself. It wasn't an attack of strength, but of precision and speed. The heavy wooden door of the shed exploded inward, splintered wood flying across the cramped space. The creature, low and fast, was instantly inside. Reed fired instinctively. The rifle blast was deafening. The creature made a horrifying, wet screech, a sound that was pure non-mammalian distress, and slammed into the wall, a spray of dark blood hitting the wood. It crumpled instantly. Before Reed could reload, the other clicking creatures vanished. The silence that followed was absolute, a terrifying vacuum after the noise. Elias was rigid, breathing shallowly. "You got it, detective. You got it." Reed, his ears ringing, approached the creature cautiously, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was undeniably dead. He kicked it gently with his boot. In the faint, flickering light of the lantern, the reality of the creature was worse than the sketch. It was not a mutated dog. Its body was long and slender, covered in the coarse black fur. Its limbs were too long, its joints too flexible, giving it the crawling gait Elias had described. The head was flat, the snout long and covered in bony plates, and the wide-set eyes were now dull. Most disturbingly, its mouth was filled not with canine teeth, but with rows of tiny, conical, needle-sharp teeth, and its front paws ended in 3 long, hard, retractable claws, the source of the fine parallel scratches. "My God," Reed breathed, looking down at the unclassified corpse. "It's real. It's some form of unlisted carnivore." The psychological horror of Elias's fear was now replaced by the cold, scientific dread of the unknown biological threat. Reed knew the shooting would attract attention, and he needed to secure the specimen immediately. This was no longer a local mystery. It was a matter for the highest levels of scientific inquiry. The following morning was a blur of frantic activity. Jed Thorne, staring at the dead creature, a thing of nightmare brought into harsh reality, finally apologized to his son, a broken, tearful admission of guilt. "Forgive me, Elias. I should have believed you." Reed secured the creature's carcass, wrapping it in heavy canvas and concealing it in the cabin's small root cellar, convincing Jed that any public display would cause panic and potentially attract more of the pack. Reed knew he couldn't transport it across state lines without authorization. He sent Elias, now a figure of newfound authority and fear, to the nearest telegraph office with an urgent encoded message to his Pinkerton contacts. Need immediate discretion and contact with Dr. Aris Thorne, no relation to Elias, noted Chicago entomologist, naturalist. Field discovery of unclassified organism, extremely aggressive. Local danger. Dr. Aris Thorne was a respected but eccentric naturalist known for studying rare insect and small vertebrate life in the American interior. He arrived 3 days later on the first available train, a small, bespectacled man with precise movements and a case full of specialized instruments. Reed met him at the station, dispensing with pleasantries immediately. "Dr. Thorne, I apologize for the secrecy, but you must understand the potential panic this could cause." He led the scientist directly to the root cellar. Dr. Thorne unwrapped the canvas with a strange, clinical excitement. He didn't recoil. Instead, he approached the carcass with the focused intensity of a man finding the missing piece to an impossible puzzle. He spent an hour taking measurements, samples, and meticulous notes, using a magnifying glass to examine the teeth and the oily black fur. "It is fascinating," Dr. Thorne murmured, his voice hushed with wonder. "The locomotion suggested by the tracks. It's cursorial, Detective. Built for speed, not climbing. The eyes, they reflect horizontally, like a deep-sea fish, but these live in the shadows of the forest floor. They see the change in light, not the object itself." He examined the strange conical teeth, a diet of small, hard-shelled prey, perhaps, and noticed the hard, bone-like plates around the snout and skull. Protection, clearly. This is a highly specialized predatory evolution. It is not mammalian, not reptilian, not purely insectoid. It's a completely unknown branch of evolutionary development. Reed presented the original fecal pellet. Dr. Thorne analyzed it quickly. Highly concentrated protein and chitin residue. This creature preys on something with a hard exoskeleton and dense muscle tissue. "What could it be, Doctor? Something hidden in the caves?" Reed pressed. Dr. Thorne straightened up, adjusting his spectacles, and his enthusiasm suddenly cooled, replaced by a deep, professional hesitation. "That's the issue, Detective. Its physical structure suggests a subterranean or extremely isolated existence, but everything I know about deep-dwelling, unclassified species suggests they are usually solitary, not pack animals, and their diet usually consists of creatures only found in their specific habitat." He looked at Elias, who had been watching the entire examination with an unnerving calmness, the trauma having created a shell of forced detachment. "Elias, I need you to recall every detail. Did you ever see them feeding? Did they leave scraps?" "No, sir. They just took Barnaby. They were hunting me. They didn't seem interested in anything else." Elias's statement was chilling. Dr. Thorne's face paled slightly. If they are hunting large, warm-blooded mammals in a pack, the energy expenditure is massive. They would need a sustainable, nearby food source that is not us. This creature, by its biology, should not be hunting in this manner, in this location, at this time of year. Reed noticed the subtle shift in the scientist's demeanor, the transition from scientific excitement to professional concern. "Doctor, what are you not telling me? I am questioning the context of this discovery, Detective, Thorne admitted. This creature is a marvel of specialization. It shouldn't exist here. It suggests either a very recent displacement from its primary habitat or something else. The fear is real, the creature is real, but the situation is biologically improbable. Dr. Thorne agreed to take the carcass back to Chicago for proper dissection and study, emphasizing the need for absolute secrecy. He packed his instruments, leaving Reed with a chilling parting thought. Detective, I believe you. This creature is unclassified, dangerous, and real. But its presence here is the greater mystery. It seems to have been engineered to prey on whatever its specialized diet dictates. Find out what its natural food source is, and you will understand why it's here. I fear that source is related to the economic activity in Oakhaven. Reed watched the doctor leave, the weight of the investigation shifting again. It was no longer a simple hunt for an unknown animal. It was a criminal investigation into a biological displacement, a mystery tied to the harsh realities of the logging camp itself. The human element was returning to the center of the terror. With Dr. Thorne gone, Reed and Elias intensified their investigation, focusing on the logging operations themselves. If the creature's presence was unnatural, it had to be tied to a disruption in the local environment, a disruption caused by the mill. They began systematically searching the areas of the forest that had been recently clear-cut or otherwise disturbed by the logging crews, specifically looking for evidence of the specialized, exoskeleton-rich food source Dr. Thorne had hypothesized. Their search led them far north of the main camp to an area Jed Thorne hadn't worked for years, a remote rocky hillside prone to subterranean shifts. Elias, remembering his terror, was now an invaluable guide, navigating the deep woods with practiced ease, his fear replaced by a cold, calculating determination. It was Elias who found the site. It wasn't a cave, but a massive, freshly collapsed sinkhole, a dark, jagged moor in the earth, concealed by dense underbrush and a recent small landslide. The sinkhole had clearly been caused by recent heavy logging vibrations decades prior, which had weakened the substrata, only to be fully exposed by a recent minor earthquake. As they approached the edge, a sickening, pervasive odor hit them, a smell of stale sulfur, decaying protein, and something metallic and mineral-rich. It was the smell of a large, unventilated subterranean den. "It's here," Reed murmured, pulling out a length of rope and a lantern. "This is where they came from." Elias was the first to notice the detail. Scattered around the lip of the sinkhole were fragments of hard, brown, segmented exoskeletons, far too large and dense to belong to any common forest insect. They were the size of small fists, and the material was incredibly thick, almost like baked pottery. Reed collected a handful of the fragments. "This is their food source, Elias," the chitin Dr. Thorne spoke of. "Whatever these creatures are, they're specialized to consume this." He carefully lowered the lantern into the sinkhole. The light cut through the foul air, revealing a large, unstable cavern below. The floor was strewn with thousands of the discarded exoskeletal fragments, a horrifying carpet of biological waste. But the light also reflected off something else, a damp, shimmering glaze covering a section of the cavern wall. "What is that?" Elias asked, his voice tight. "I don't know," Reed replied, his mind racing. He was getting too far from his professional scope. This was geology and biology, not crime. But the threat to Oakhaven was paramount. They spent the next hour mapping the exterior of the sinkhole, noting that the three-pronged tracks were abundant here, showing a clear, established route in and out of the cavern. They also noted something else chilling. The tracks led away from the sinkhole in a deliberate, expanding radial pattern, focusing heavily on the area surrounding the Thorne cabin and the logging camp. They're not just feeding on those shells anymore. Elias realized, the horror dawning on him. They've moved out. The logging must have dried up their supply, or the collapse scattered them. Now they're looking for a new source of protein. And that source Reed finished grimly, is us, or the livestock. Reed was faced with a terrible decision. He could seal the sinkhole, but the creatures were already established outside. He could warn the town, but the panic would be uncontrollable, and the lumber company, which owned the land, would certainly deny any environmental disturbance that could halt operations. As he stood at the edge of the sinkhole, documenting his findings, a small piece of the upper earth crumbled away, revealing something buried beneath the rocks and roots. A piece of rotting canvas and rusted metal. Reed carefully pulled it free. It was a partially preserved canvas rucksack, bearing the faint, faded lettering of a geological survey company from 2 decades prior. Inside, he found a sealed, wax paper-wrapped journal, its pages water-damaged but still legible. The journal belonged to a geologist named Henry Kelleher, who had been part of a team surveying the area in the 1870s, long before Oakhaven was established. The final entry, dated 1879, was scribbled frantically. The strata is unique. We found a vast, self-contained ecosystem beneath the limestone shelf. A species of troglodytic arthropod. Kelleher had drawn a detailed sketch of the massive, shell creature fragments that sustains itself in the mineral-rich environment. And with it, a secondary predator, small, nocturnal, and highly specialized to prey upon the arthropod's dense shell. They move in packs. We disturbed the access point. They are coming out. My team is gone. They took them whole. The clicking. I hear the clicking. Reed closed the journal, the truth hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The creatures weren't unclassified. They were an isolated, cave-dwelling predator that had been perfectly adapted to consume a specific, hard-shelled invertebrate. The logging and subsequent land shift had collapsed their original habitat, forcing them into the surface world and shifting their highly specialized diet to the only available substitute: soft-skinned, warm-blooded mammals. Elias's fear wasn't a delusion. It was a biological certainty. The creatures were not supernatural. They were victims of a human-caused ecological disaster, and now they were making humans their prey. The terror was now rooted in the cold, hard reality of human negligence. The geologist's journal was the final, devastating piece of evidence. Reed and Elias returned to the cabin under the cover of a freezing drizzle, the journal carefully tucked into Reed's inner coat pocket. The creatures were not monsters. They were a highly specialized predator forced into a new environment. They were after those arthropods, Elias stated, sitting by the fire, his tone flat. Now that their shells are broken and scattered, they need the protein. And we're the closest source. Exactly, Reed confirmed. Their whole evolutionary purpose was to hunt something with a hard shell, which is why their claws are like that, to pry open the prey. They're built for speed and infiltration, not brute force, which explains why they rely on the pack and the silent movement. The problem wasn't the creature itself, but the scale of the threat. If the pack was large, Oakhaven was sitting on a biological powder keg. Reed knew the town's small population of loggers, isolated and dismissive of anything not directly related to timber, was completely unprepared. They began preparing the cabin for a siege. They reinforced the windows with shutters and moved the furniture to block the door, creating a defensive perimeter. Jed Thorne worked in grim silence, no longer questioning the danger, only focused on survival. "We have to warn the town, detective," Jed insisted, loading a handful of shells for the rifle. "They have to know about the sinkhole." "And say what, Jed?" "That a pack of unclassified subterranean carnivores is hunting them because our logging operations disturbed their cave-dwelling food source," Reed countered. "They'll either laugh us out of the saloon or create a panic that will result in a disorganized massacre." Reed knew his responsibility as a Pinkerton agent: protect the innocent and expose the truth, but also prevent mass hysteria. He had to control the narrative and the response. "We need proof they'll accept, and a plan they can execute," Reed decided. "They won't believe a geologist's diary from 20 years ago. They need a current, immediate threat to rally against. He remembered the dense, shimmering glaze on the cave wall and the metallic smell. Elias, when your father was logging years ago, what kind of mineral was extracted from the deeper cuts around that hillside? Jed paused, his brow furrowed in thought. Low-grade cinnabar, mercury ore. The vein ran right beneath that sinkhole, but the cost of refining was too high, so they stopped. Alistair Reed felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Cinnabar, mercury sulfide, the smell of rotten sulfur. Dr. Thorne mentioned the mineral-rich environment of the arthropods. What if the metallic, oily smell we noticed on the tracks isn't just oil? What if the creatures are absorbing the heavy mineral in their environment or in their prey, and it's being excreted through their skin or breath? This was the terrifying connection. The highly specialized, isolated biology of the creatures was tied to the geological environment, which was now contaminated by the logging process. Reed looked at the journal, specifically the last entry. Kelleher's terror was palpable. They are coming out. The clicking. They made a list of the community's assets. The mill's steam boiler, a source of intense heat, the dynamite stored for clearing stumps, and the small local pharmacy's supply of carbolic acid, a strong disinfectant. They needed a strategic advantage. The mill, Reed concluded. We use the noise and the light to our advantage. The creature I shot reacted to the sound of the gun. They rely on silence and shadow. We use the mill's operations to disorient them and draw them to one location. But they needed the town's help. Reed knew exactly who to target first. The mill foreman, Silas Vane, a pragmatic, tight-fisted man who cared only about the bottom line and the safety of his timber. He needed to be shown the threat in a way he couldn't deny. The plan was set. Elias would remain with his father at the cabin, securing the perimeter, while Reed would brave the night alone, heading toward Oakhaven with the creature's carcass and the geologist's journal. The undeniable proof of a human-caused disaster leading to biological terror. The clicking began just as Reed stepped out the door, louder this time, less tentative. It was a clear, coordinated sound, a hunting signal. He didn't look back. The fog of fear was gone. Only the sharp focus of the investigator remained. The tension is real, and the mystery is about to be completely unraveled. To see the devastating truth behind these creatures and Elias's fate, subscribe now and share this video. Your support keeps our investigation in the shadows alive. Alistair Reed reached Oakhaven just after midnight, the canvas-wrapped carcass tied securely to his saddle. The town was asleep, nestled under the chilling blanket of the winter night, utterly oblivious to the biological terror stalking the edges of the forest. He went straight to the mill foreman, Silas Vane, waking him with a forceful knock. Vane, a man who saw no threat greater than a drop in timber prices, was initially furious. It's the Thorne boy's madness, isn't it? Get out, detective. I'll not have my business disturbed by folklore. Reed simply unceremoniously dumped the canvas-wrapped creature onto Vane's pristine kitchen floor. The foreman's rage instantly froze, replaced by a sickening mix of shock and revulsion. What in God's name is that? Vane choked out, backing away. A predator, Mr. Vane. A subterranean predator displaced by a sinkhole on the north slope, Reed stated, his voice calm and authoritative. A highly specialized carnivore. And I have reason to believe its presence is a direct result of the extensive logging your operation conducted near the old cinnabar vein. Reed produced the geologist's journal and quickly summarized Kelleher's findings and Dr. Thorne's confirmation. The creatures had been forced out and were now turning to human prey. He presented the fecal pellet, the scratch marks, and the anatomical oddities, transforming Vane's fear into a terrifying recognition of responsibility. Vane was a practical man, and the evidence, a dead, unclassified animal, coupled with a dated official geological report pointing to a hidden danger, was undeniable. His face, usually ruddy with temper, turned a ghastly gray. He realized the potential catastrophe. Not just the deaths, but the complete financial ruin and the ensuing government inquiry. "How many?" Vane whispered, his voice trembling. Elias counted at least 4 in a coordinated pack. "They are fast, silent, and they hunt in the deep darkness. They're likely already adapting to our methods." Reed leaned in. "You can't call the sheriff. You can't call the army. We need to handle this locally, quickly, and decisively, or the panic will destroy Oakhaven before the creatures do." Reed laid out his plan. They would use the mill as a trap. Vane, now fully invested in containing the disaster, agreed, his terror mixed with a desperate need for control. Over the next few hours, in total secrecy, Vane and Reed mobilized a small, trusted group of older loggers, men who knew the forest and who would follow Vane's authority without questioning the impossible details. Reed kept the full, gruesome truth of the creature's origins limited to Vane, telling the men only that they were facing a pack of highly aggressive, mutated cave wolves driven mad by the cold. Their plan was precise. 1. Noise light distraction. Start the mill's steam boiler and turn on all electric lights, a rarity in 1899, creating a massive, noisy, visible target. 2. Lure. Use a controlled scent, a large, freshly butchered deer carcass to draw the creatures out of the dense woods. 3. Containment. The loggers, armed with rifles and axes, would take up positions on the mill's raised platforms, forcing the creatures onto the exposed open-ground log-sorting yard. 4. The trap. Dynamite charges would be set at the mouth of the sinkhole to seal the source, and a final, larger charge would be set within the mill yard itself. As the sun began to rise, bathing the cold, silent town in a sickly yellow light, the plan was ready. The steam mill, usually a symbol of Oakhaven's industry, was about to become a dark, mechanical bait. The human element was now fully engaged. The loggers, rough and cynical, were unified by a terrifying, shared purpose. Reed, the pragmatic detective, was leading an improvised, desperate militia against a threat that should have remained buried. He sent one final, brief messenger to the Thorn cabin. "The trap is set. Stay secure. Do not leave the cabin under any circumstance." The final, decisive confrontation was about to begin, and Reed knew that in the end, it wouldn't be his skills as a detective, but the logger's primal will to survive that would decide the fate of Oakhaven. The mill yard came alive as dusk approached, transforming the commercial hub into a fortress of steel and noise. The steam boiler roared into a fever pitch, a massive pressurized heartbeat drowning out the natural sounds of the forest. The flywheel, a colossal iron disc, spun at a terrifying velocity, and the harsh electric arc lights, rare, powerful beacons in the 1899 darkness, flickered violently to life, cutting brutal, blinding swathes through the descending gloom. The cacophony of noise and light was overwhelming and deliberate, the exact, disorienting opposite of the silent, dark environment the creatures preferred. The tension was suffocating, a heavy, cold presence that pressed down on the men. Reed and Vane directed the 6 armed loggers to their elevated positions on the lumber platforms and the roof of the sorting shed. Each man was a silhouette against the harsh light, their faces grim, their grips tight on their rifles. Alistair Reed, sighting his rifle from the precarious height of a 20-foot lumber stack, watched the edge of the woods. The bait, the freshly butchered deer carcass, lay 40 yards away, starkly visible under the glare, an offering of warm blood and muscle. Minutes stretched into an hour. The only sound was the incessant clank-whir of the machinery, the hiss of steam valves, and the rapid, unsteady thump-thump of their own pulses. Doubt began to creep back into the loggers' eyes, their shared fear beginning to fracture under the sheer absurdity of the wait. Was this merely a fool's errand led by a hysterical boy and an outsider detective? Then, in a momentary lapse of the machinery's rhythm, the clicking began. It wasn't the tentative, distant sound Elias had first reported. This was a rapid, aggressive rhythm, a sharp, dry crt 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 coming from 3 distinct points at the tree line. It was a communication, a declaration. The pack was here, drawn by the scent and the disturbing lack of normal forest activity. They emerged silently, low, oily black blurs moving with that unnatural, scuttling gait. There were 7 of them, each moving with the synchronized, frightening efficiency of a hunting insect hive. The sudden, overwhelming light seemed to disorient them momentarily, their reflective horizontal eyes flashing wildly as they processed the environment. But the thick, coppery scent of fresh blood from the carcass immediately focused their terrifying attention, overriding the sensory assault. The pack rushed the bait, their low profiles making them almost invisible against the sawdust-covered ground. They ignored the lights and the noise in the singular focus of their hunger. "Hold! Wait for the cluster! Keep your barrels steady!" Reed yelled, his voice strained, barely audible over the steam engine's continuous roar. He watched through the rifle sight as the 7 creatures tore into the carcass, a black, writhing mass of feeding frenzy. As the creatures tore into the deer, Vane gave the signal. He raised his lantern high, then dropped it. Dynamite. A deafening Ka boom erupted from the north slope, the sound of the sinkhole being sealed forever, the earth trembling under the force of the explosion. The creatures, already agitated and hyper-aware, immediately scattered violently from the bait, their attention drawn to the secondary sound, the profound tremor in the earth that signaled the destruction of their habitat. This was the opening, the moment of disorientation and displacement. "Now, fire. Aim low. Don't waste your shot," Reed commanded, his finger tightening on the trigger. The loggers opened fire. The heavy rifle rounds tore through the mill yard, their reports echoing like secondary blasts. The creatures, fast and hard to track, screeched in agony, their dry, rasping cries cutting through the noise with an unnatural pitch. 2 dropped instantly, their strange bodies spasming violently. A third, wounded and clicking in distressed confusion, fled toward the dark, inviting space beneath the main mill floor. Reed focused his fire and his detective's mind on the remaining 4, his goal now shifting not on killing, but on containment and control. They couldn't let them escape back into the surrounding community and the darkness. "Block the south exit. Keep the line. Drive them toward the center," Vane roared, his fear now fully channeled into a desperate, focused command. The remaining creatures, driven by primal survival instinct, abandoned the lure of the blood and turned their attention to the nearest, moving, soft-skinned targets, the loggers. They moved with terrifying speed. One creature launched itself at the closest elevated platform, scrabbling vertically up the rough-cut wood with impossible, frictionless quickness. A logger, Old Man Crowley, a grizzled man who had faced down bears and bad timber, yelled in visceral terror as the creature neared his boot. He swung his heavy logging axe with a desperate heavy arc, a final primal act of defense. The blade connected with a sickening crunch of bone and shell, severing the creature's midsection. It dropped, clicking and writhing like a broken mechanism, until a final, precise rifle shot from Vane silenced it. But the remaining 3 were a coordinated force, learning and adapting to the threat. They began circling, using the long, stark shadows cast by the flickering arc lights to their advantage, their clicking sounds now becoming a frantic, rhythmic, and strategic communication. They were herding their prey. Reed knew he had to draw them. He descended from the platform, sprinting toward the center of the yard, the predetermined kill zone, the point where the final, massive charge of dynamite had been placed beneath a loose pile of wet sawdust and timber scrap. "Reed, get back! You'll be caught!" Vane screamed, his voice cracking with panic. Reed ignored him, the roar of the machinery filling his ears. He reached the center, dropped a lit fuse with a precise, steady hand, and ran for cover behind a massive stacked log, just as the three remaining creatures, sensing the movement and the threat, converged on the light and the center mass movement. He watched the final, horrifying moments in a detached clinical observation. The creatures, driven by the need to eliminate the primary threat, launched themselves at the pile of sawdust just as the fuse reached the charge. A final, colossal crack ripped through Oak Haven, not just a sound but a physical assault. The flash was blinding, the earth shuddering. The sound was so massive it shattered every window in the town center. When the smoke, steam, and pulverized sawdust settled, the mill yard was silent, save for the pathetic, sustained hiss of the ruptured steam engine. The loggers converged slowly, rifles aimed, moving through the haze. The blast had obliterated the center of the yard, leaving a deep, scorched crater of pulverized earth and charred wood. The three creatures were gone, reduced to biological fragments and ash. The immediate threat was over. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than any noise. Reed, exhausted, his ears ringing but his mind sharply focused, addressed the loggers. "The threat is neutralized. You saved this town. We will secure the sinkhole, and we will burn every piece of biological evidence here. No word of this creature gets out. It was a pack of rabid cave dogs driven out by the logging, understood? This is a secret kept by Oak Haven, for its own survival." The men, looking at the crater, the dead animals, and the sheer impossibility of what they had faced, nodded grimly. They had confronted something too terrifying to share. The story would be contained. The terrifying anatomy of a necessary hoax was complete. But as Reed walked back toward the safety of the Thorn cabin, the victory felt cold and hollow. He had contained the biological threat, but the mystery remained. The core question that had troubled Dr. Thorne still gnawed at him. Why were they hunting Elias so specifically, and why was the clicking so prevalent at the Thorne property? He found the answer that night, not in the woods, not in a report, but in the heart of the home. He found the answer that night, not in the scorched earth of the mill yard, but in the quiet, firelit space of the Thorn cabin. Elias had been compulsively cleaning the rifle Jed had provided him, the routine and necessary balm after the night's adrenaline. As he disassembled the barrel, preparing to wipe the action, Elias revealed a subtle modification, a tiny, almost invisible metal tube, carefully, expertly soldered to the underside of the scope housing. It was a detail only a trained eye would spot, a piece of custom engineering masked by soot and grime. "Elias, what is this?" Reed asked, pointing at the tube with a sudden icy clarity. The cold, intellectual dread of the impending revelation was worse than facing the pack. Elias stopped cleaning, his movement slow and deliberate. He looked up, his eyes heavy with the residue of exhaustion, and something much colder. Calculated necessity. "It's a whistle, detective. A high-frequency lure. I learned how to build it from an old trapper's journal I found abandoned in the mill archives, a thing they used to call a coyote caller. It's tuned to an extremely high registry. It creates a sound that only very specific hyperacute predators can hear, a sound that, to those creatures, is a distress or territorial signal." Alistair Reed stared at the boy, and the truth of the whole affair snapped into terrifying, agonizing focus. The creature's amplified sensitivity due to the cinnabar exposure, the constant unnatural presence of the clicking near the cabin, the sheer conviction of the boy's story, it all made a chilling human sense. "You drew them, Elias. You didn't just see them, you lured them. You were amplifying their presence, making your cabin the primary target," Reed stated, his voice a low, heavy weight of realization. Elias nodded, his gaze unwavering, his voice steady with a terrifying composure. "They were chasing me, yes, but only randomly. They were too slow and too random to draw any serious attention. I needed proof, I needed someone to believe me, or they would have just kept saying I was crazy until the pack grew and overwhelmed us. The clicking wasn't constant because they weren't always there. I made the clicking constant. I used the sound of the lure to draw them close, and then I used the evidence from the one you shot to make you stay. I had to create a crisis you couldn't walk away from. The true monster wasn't the creature. It was the calculated, terrifying logic of a terrified human being driven to the brink. Elias had orchestrated the entire psychological terror, the fear, the escalation, the urgency, to validate his original, authentic fear and secure external assistance. He was not mad. He was brilliantly, ruthlessly manipulative, a survivor hardened by isolation and the town's indifference. "Barnaby," Reed said, the name hanging in the quiet air like a judgment. "Did you use him as bait?" Elias stared into the fire, the truth etched into his pale face, utterly devoid of false remorse. Barnaby was sick, Detective. He was going to die anyway. I left him out by the shed, where I knew they were circling. The clicking started immediately after. It was the only way to confirm they were truly in range and interested in mammalian protein. I had to know. Reed realized the full extent of Elias's calculated risk and sacrifice. The boy hadn't suffered a psychological break. He had executed a strategic campaign of terror to secure his own survival and the safety of his community, leveraging his unique knowledge of the woods and the creature's behavior. He had known exactly what kind of physical evidence would appeal to a pragmatic observer like a Pinkerton detective. "You risked the lives of every man in Oakhaven, Elias, including your father's, to validate your story," Reed stated, his voice now carefully neutral, devoid of personal judgment. "They risked my life, Detective," Elias countered, looking up, his eyes now hard and cold with justified resentment. "They said I was crazy. They ignored the scratches and the pellets. They would have continued logging, weakening the ground until the whole pack overran the town. I stopped them. You helped me stop them. The town is safe now." Alistair Reed, the arbiter of justice and truth, was faced with an impossible ethical choice. He had a brilliant, deeply traumatized, and ruthlessly practical teenager who had committed acts of manipulation and sacrifice, but whose actions had undeniably saved the entire community from a genuine, scientifically proven catastrophe. Exposing Elias would undermine the entire rabid cave dogs hoax, causing a massive panic that could unravel Oakhaven and potentially lead to the boy's incarceration or committal to an asylum, a fate worse than the woods. Reed made his final decision, the choice of a detective who understood that justice sometimes demanded silence and controlled truths. The truth of the creature's origin and the logging company's negligence is now safely contained in my reports to the Pinkerton Agency and Dr. Thorne. "That is the official record of the disaster," Reed said, picking up the modified rifle. "The truth of this whistle and your actions, Elias, will remain in this room between you and me. It will never be written down." He disassembled the rifle, removing the custom whistle and placing the tiny metal piece directly into the heart of the dying embers. The tiny metal piece glowed red-hot, then warped and melted, becoming an unrecognizable, liquid glob of metal. The final piece of evidence destroyed. "You understand the weight of this silence?" Reed asked, his eyes piercing the gloom. Elias nodded, the ghost of his fear finally retreating under the weight of his calculated success. "I understand that I'm safe now, and Oakhaven is safe. That's what matters." Jed Thorne entered the room, his eyes red from lack of sleep and the profound trauma of the night. "It's done, Detective. The mill yard is cleaned, the sinkhole is sealed with rock and pitch. The town owes you their lives. What now?" Reed placed the rifle back in Jed's hands, the smooth wood cool under the logger's grip. "Now, Mr. Thorne, you go back to logging, but you stay away from the North Slope." Your son, Elias, proved to be an invaluable witness and tracker. He is a brave boy. Keep him close. Alistair Reed left Oakhaven at dawn, riding away from the smoking ruins of the mill and the town, which was already beginning to stir back to a nervous but safe normalcy. He left behind a necessary lie, the official story of rabid dogs, and a young man forever marked by a terrible, calculated truth. His final report, filed 3 weeks later, simply stated that a rare, rabid pack of aggressive local carnivores had been eliminated after being driven out by extreme weather and logging activity. The case was officially closed. A few months later, Reed received a small sealed box from Dr. Aris Thorne. Inside was a vial containing a sample of the creature's skin. Attached was a handwritten note. The epidermal tissue shows high concentrations of mercury, likely absorbed from the cinnabar in the cave water. It would have made their sense of smell hyperacute, their movements erratic, and possibly amplified their sensitivity to high-frequency sounds. A fascinating, tragic case of forced adaptation. Reed crushed the note in his hand, the paper crumbling to dust. He knew the true, chilling implication. Elias's lure was simply an amplification of the biological trauma the environment had already inflicted on the creatures. He hadn't created the terror. He had simply recognized its potential and weaponized it with the ruthless efficiency of a true survivor. Alistair Reed never forgot the silence of Oakhaven, or the cold, terrifying intelligence in Elias Thorne's eyes. The real horror was not the unclassified beast, but the realization that a human being, pushed to the edge by disbelief and fear, could become the most precise and ruthlessly effective predator of all. The shadow of Oakhaven was gone, but the silent, psychological scar of Elias Thorne's necessary deception remained.